First, we're going to welcome Valerie Shute, an old friend of mine, Professor Emeritus of Ed, Psych, and Learning Systems at the Florida State University, and she will address the future of stealth assessment.
Let me share my slides. Hi, everybody. Do I have slide sharing capabilities?
Between chat and record at the bottom.
Yeah, I'm bringing my, okay.
Good, now it's happening, yes. Good.
Okay, great. So hi, and thanks to everybody for showing up today. What I'd like to do is talk about some of my ideas for scaling up some work that I've been doing for the last decade or so. It's called stealth assessment, and it uses games and the stealth assessment machinery to measure and support all different types of learning. So before I present some of the possible paths for scaling it up, I've got a couple of slides here that briefly describe what it is and how it works for those that don't know about it. So basically, you've got a kid playing a game. They're producing all sorts of performance data that are captured in the log file and then automatically analyzed with the stealth assessment machinery. And then the results of that are output in real time and at various grain sizes to the student model. And then the updated student model uses those current estimates of competency states in order to provide feedback and other kinds of learning supports back to the player, who continues to play the game, produce more data, and round and round it goes. So some of the features of stealth assessment are, and this is when I formulated it back in around 2009 or so, it's intended to be seamless and ubiquitous. So with seamless, I mean that it's buried deeply into the game itself so that it's invisible. And so learning and assessment become blurred. And ubiquitous means that it's running at all times. The other feature of stealth assessment is I intended it to be formative as opposed to summative. So the intention is to support learning and not just serve as judge and jury. And finally, it's intended to provide very accurate and rich models of the learner. And this is made possible because the models embodied in the stealth assessment are based on something called evidence-centered design, or ECD. Again, because this is very brief, evidence-centered design was formulated 20 years ago by Bob Mislevy and Linda Steinberg and Russell Almond. And there's two foci. It provides a way to reason about assessment design, how to create excellent assessments, and it provides a way to reason about student performance. So when you go from left to right, it lets us accomplish excellent assessments. And it starts with articulating your competency model. What all do you want to measure? This is in terms of, what do you want to say about a person in terms of their knowledge, skills, dispositions, whatever. So it involves identifying and structuring the relevant variables. And note that this is a theoretical model. Next is the evidence model, and this involves establishing specific relationships between these theoretical variables and their associated metrics, how you're going to measure that stuff. And finally, the task or the action model involves defining specific features of tasks that will elicit the evidence that's needed in this. So say a kid, now when you reverse the flow, it lets us accomplish diagnosis, and that's the key part of the story here. So a kid is playing a game and maybe solves or doesn't solve a level. So these are a series of actions right here in the yellow box. Those data are automatically submitted to the evidence model, which parses and scores those data. So these are observable data right here. And then those observable data are statistically linked back to the competency model variables. And those updated variables are then reinserted into the larger competency model. So at any time and any grain size, you know how well or poorly a kid is doing, a person is doing. So the question is, does this stuff actually work? We've now run probably over 4,000 kids using stealth assessment in various games, mostly a game we developed called Physics Playground. And this is a result of one study. There's a link to it down below. Let's see, this was before COVID, so this was actually in the school itself. So we tested 263 kids. They were 9th to 11th graders. It was in their science class. We tested across 6 days. So they had about 4 hours of gameplay data each kid. They played altogether 91 game levels, and this covered the 9 main physics topics that we were measuring using Physics Playground. I'll show you just some of these topics: Newton's first law, second law, third law of force and motion, and so forth. I'm not going to go into details of the content. Let's see, we also tested a full set of different learning supports. And we had cognitive and affective supports. I don't have, well, I'll give you a peek of what those look like. So we had cognitive supports of a variety of different kinds of supports and affective supports. But in this study, we just looked at the cognitive supports. We had an external physics pre-test and post-test, and this was based on the FCI, the Force Concept Inventory. And this was necessary for validation purposes, I'll talk about in a minute. And we had game and learning support questionnaire data. So the 3 main questions were as follows. What's the deal with the psychometric qualities? Are these stealth assessment measures actually reliable? Are they valid? And are they fair? That's the foundational critical issue, because everything else is moot from that point. The second question was, did kids overall learn any physics from playing the game, and did they enjoy the game? And the third question had to do with the learning supports, and it was which learning supports were most effective in enhancing learning and game performance. So I'll blow through the results pretty quickly and share with you again the link to the paper if you want to read it. But in terms of reliability, we had a lot of different ways to measure it. And the bottom line is, yeah, the stealth assessment measures were reliable. We did a confirmatory factor analysis on the data. The fit index was very high, the error was low, so that was good. Interclass correlation in Cronbach's alpha was also really good. So we could say, yeah, the stealth assessment measures were reliable. The next important question had to do with validity. So we had our external measure, again, based on the Force Concept Inventory, and we had our in-game estimates of physics understanding overall. And in fact, those significantly correlated with the pre-test and the post-test data. Yay, that was good. We also looked at the individual facets. We had, force and motion, linear momentum, energy, and torque. And we looked at the associated counterparts on the pre-test and post-test items, and those two correlated. And that's real important for diagnostic purposes. In terms of equity and fairness, we had the same number of males and females and a range of ethnicities. In terms of learning by gender, this again touches on the equity and fairness issue. While the boys started out with a little higher physics knowledge, as evidenced on their pretest scores, at the end of the day, there was no significant outcome differences by gender. That was really good. And the same deal for ethnicity. There was probably a little advantage for the white students on their pretest, but at the end of the day, there was no significant outcome differences by ethnicity. So that was good news. The next question was about learning and enjoyment. So overall, the students that played the game scored significantly higher on the post-test than the pretest. And the control group showed no pre-test to post-test differences. And in terms of enjoyment, it's really a fun game. Kids and teachers and parents really like to play it. In fact, IES is really been bugging me to scale the game of Physics Playground up. But in terms of enjoyment, kids enjoyed the game on a 1 to 5 scale. The mean was 4.03. And by gender, males and females enjoyed it equally. And by ethnicity, whites, blacks, and Hispanics also enjoyed it equally. So for fairness, that was a good thing. In terms of learning supports, which of those 8 different learning supports that we tested actually predicted outcome? And the answer is only physics videos significantly predicted outcome. So that's where we're focusing our attention now. And physics videos, the frequency of viewing physics videos also significantly impacted their gameplay in terms of levels completed and the coins that they earned. And finally, and this was very important for me, the supports did not take away from the fun factor. Now, one thing that I cautioned in the design of all the learning supports was we will not use any talking heads. It had to be, an intimate, it integrated into the game, game-like and so forth. So the students who watched more physics videos actually reported higher levels of enjoyment than those that watched fewer. So not only do the physics videos improve learning and gameplay, they didn't take away from the fun factor, which was really important for me, because that's the whole point of using games, is engage the students. So that brings me to the question of how to scale this stuff up across the years. So I came up with 8 different ideas. And let me see what time it is. I think I'm doing okay on time. And the first one is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and it has to do with this idea of merging and validating different learning analytic approaches. So stealth assessment using ECD models is mainly theoretical or top down, but I want to combine that with more exploratory bottom-up approaches, which are more black box, like educational data mining and machine learning, to identify even more indicators of learning, and that would serve to improve, I believe, predictions of learning. The next idea is to broaden measurements beyond just log file data. And so this idea involves including physiological data, like with GSR devices and eye tracking and facial recognition and natural language processing and self and peer report data and so forth, to move stealth assessment beyond just click-based data, which is all stored in the log file, to more fully diagnose and support various competencies. And we've done some preliminary work on that, where we've coupled the stealth assessment log file data with some facial recognition in terms of their affective states and so on. And it worked real well. These are some links to additional papers. And one of my former students, now professor at UF, is just submitted a proposal that's attempting to do just this. The third idea is to, so this is more horizontal scaling, is to design, develop, and test stealth assessments for new competencies. So to date, we've developed stealth assessments to measure a whole bunch of things, sometimes running in parallel in systems, but we can successfully measure and support physics understanding, calculus, creativity, problem solving, persistence, computational thinking, systems thinking, collaboration, and so on. But there's so many more attributes and populations. We've been focusing mainly on middle school and high school, but a project I'm working on with Sensio Analytics, their population is HBCUs, and trying to identify who's on the at risk for dropping out. The fourth idea is to recycle models. So turns out ECD models, as lovely and powerful as they are pretty costly to develop. So if we develop one, can we reuse the models? So some preliminary work that we've done testing this is we took the same competency model for collaborative problem solving, and we used it in 2 different games, Physics Playground and Minecraft, and it worked with virtually no tweaking whatsoever needed. Now, the most expensive part of the ECD models is, in fact, coming up with a good competency model, a fully fleshed out competency model. And then I note here that reusing evidence models and task models might be a little harder because they're tied to the particular game mechanics. So fifth idea is automate the design and development of stealth assessment. So we're doing a review of stealth assessment right now. We've identified about 100 different places around the world that are doing stealth assessment stuff. And some of the people, some of the researchers are trying to automate the design and development of the stealth assessment models, which would, again, fit into these broader ideas. For example, James Lester's lab and Russell Allman's Peanut Suite. Sixth idea, this is one I've been wanting to do for a long time too, is to create curriculum wrappers around the stealth assessment. So, you know that teachers are completely overwhelmed, and for, you know, to get stealth assessment into schools, consider designing game-related lessons plans that can go with the stealth assessment for teachers, along with ideas to, you know, merge it into their existing curricula. One idea I had this morning was to use the next generation science standards as a crosswalk to accomplish that. Seventh idea is figure out ways to communicate stealth assessment estimates to various stakeholders that are easy to grok. So for instance, research needed on student and teacher paging dashboards. It needs to look at ways to move students towards being, you know, self-regulated learners and, you know, helping teachers intervene. So, you know, teachers as well as students certainly can interpret Bayes nets, which is our statistical model of the probabilistic results. So we need a way to communicate that. And we've done some preliminary work on presenting those data in a palatable manner. And the last idea, and I think, yeah, that works out to 15 minutes, is to develop, and this is a big idea that I've been longing to do forever, is to develop a centralized, personalized data collection system. So instead of just having one game with stealth assessment inside of it, consider a whole suite of games or immersive environments, you know, in this hub that's used across years. You know, you could take physics all the way, you know, from elementary school up to college for vertical scaling, and also assessing and supporting all sorts of different competencies. The idea that I presented back, I think it was 2009 at a Gordon conference, was a personalized passport of competencies where, you know, this cumulative data travels with you as you go. So, you know, these cumulative centralized and personalized systems can provide, you know, valuable information, not only, you know, to the person, but to the teachers and so forth. And that was my 15 minutes story, very fast and high level.
Great. Thank you very much, Val.
Thank you.
Val, if you could stop share, please.
Okay. So I don't know if people have questions now. I sort of have a question on what you started to talk about at the end, personalized. And I'm wondering if you've ever considered really personalizing for each competency, especially for underrepresented students.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, in the last study that I shared with you, the data from that study, we actually had 4 different conditions. So we had a control condition, we had a nonlinear condition where they could choose any levels that they wanted to. We had a linear condition, which was lockstep, you do this game level, then this game level. And we had an adaptive one, which was based on their competency estimates. We gave them the next level to solve. And what we found, surprisingly, was you would think that the adaptive version of the game, and we had like 90 kids in each of the conditions.
Mhm.
And it turns out that the very best one as far as learning gains was the nonlinear version, as opposed to the adaptive or the linear version. And the reason I think is that kids like autonomy. They like to be able to, choose what they're doing, when and how and so forth. And so I was a little surprised that the adaptive version did not do as well as we had anticipated, but that too was good information. Why spend the money, for, adaptation, in-game adaptation when the nonlinear version worked real well. The
But-
free choice.
Yeah, and did you do this for, minority students as well? I mean, is there a difference? I know you showed that there's no difference, you said.
No difference overall. And that was once we determined that there was no significant difference. There was a slight gain for the nonlinear over the other ones, but essentially we collapsed those data. And that's where the ethnicity and the gender differences that I showed, actually no differences by gender and ethnicity across those 4 conditions.
Yeah,
but that was too much information to present.
But I just wonder if you customize it and personalize it, is there a difference with modules?
Well, that could certainly be looked at with the data separately to see by ethnicity if there are any differences in terms of the 4 conditions.
Yeah, we do have one question from Charlie Sue.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask your question?
Hello, hi. I'm interested in the assessment part, so I may have missed this. So how long did it take for assess the learning assessment, and let's say how effective the
Well, it
game
was cumulative. As soon as they enter the game, the assessment starts because it's tied within the game. So
the scope, like let's say how many months or
well,
even years.
I know I went really fast. It was a 4 hours of gameplay data.
Sorry, 4 hours to gameplay data?
4 hours of gameplay data, yeah.
Okay.
And I have done some studies in the past that actually looked at and plotted curves as far as at what point, do you asymptote and you don't increase reliability any further? And the answer is, after a couple hours, you get enough information. But in like game environments, when you're testing a lot of different aspects to a competency, like physics understanding, I showed you the 9 different topics that were included. You need to have a little more time because each one of those has a number of different levels that are associated with it in order to get enough data in order to make valid and reliable assessments. So all in all, after about 2-3 hours, I think we would be very comfortable specifying, in terms of validity and reliability, how well a person was doing at that point in time. But more data is always better, right?
Yeah, and how can you control some variations? Have you, again, I probably missed this. Have you compared like this game, kids learning physics with this game and kids learning without it, but with a teacher? So
yeah.
And if you did, how did you the variation? How did you manage the variation? Let's say, like kids are different and teachers are different, and for example, yeah.
Yeah, well, we collected individual differences measures. And as far as when Bev originally introduced this as different presentations on big data, we're not doing big data. We're doing lots of small, individual studies, looking at how well this works. But say your question again, individual differences, impact learning. Yeah, so we looked at differences, and I reported the summary data. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking about.
Okay, so you know what? We're going to meet separately. You can go in breakout rooms, or we can also do questions and answers afterwards.
Okay, thank you so much for your.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie.
Thank you let's thank Valerie again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And really, I like that game. Are you gonna? I hope you're gonna try to move on and scale this up like people suggest. Okay. She's off.
The answer is yes.
Good, cool.